subscribe and that itching behind your ear will stop. Alright. What are we talking about today? We're talking about the monster Duke mistook me for his wife. Alright. Right off the rip, actually a pretty good story. I actually really like this one. I think I'll give it an 8. Um, it's just kind of like, it's fun. I think the storytelling is relatively good. It's a little, it does rely on a bit of, how do I put this? It's one of those stories that does kind of rely on happenstance, I guess. Like the circumstances behind him and her meeting, the circumstances behind all of her allies that are throughout the story. Like, there's definitely a bit of like, things just happen to be this way, but I don't necessarily think that's that's not always a negative. That's more so just like, you need things to, be a little wacky to have a story, right? So I'm not going to take too much off for that. It's just, it's just something to note. But what's the gist, if you will? The main girl is brought into this story, right, that she's, aware of. And she's kind of like a nothing burger character. Of course, for plot convenience, she's, basically she's brought back as like this. She's brought as this random priest that really isn't important in the story, but of course, like, because it's a story and it's a isekai, her holy abilities are like super super powerful. And on this note, you can kind of say like, oh well, maybe this power that she possesses is more so because she's a reincarnator. So I'm not necessarily going to take too much off for that. I mean, it's just, a little silly, super powerful abilities, whatever. But the idea is she wants to get out of this kingdom because the main plot basically involves everything going to shit. So she needs to skedaddle. So she ends up leaving, this temple because they're basically just using her anyway. She ends up taking like a holy beast with her, who's like this little owl that follows her around. So she takes this holy beast, runs away, and lives her life out in this little village, right, on the outskirts of like this forest that's infested with monsters and things like that. This character is, I feel like you can tell just by looking at him, but he's the Duke. He's the monster Duke, as they say. The basic idea is he's like kind of like the main villain from the story, but that's not really that relevant. The more relevant thing is like this whole monster title is because he has like this curse that kind of branches out from like his heart. That kind of, whenever it takes over, he like consumes all life around him. She ends up kind of stumbling across him when he's like been attacked by some assassins and everything. And because she's so kind-hearted, she kind of just, decides like, well, I don't necessarily love this idea, but I'm going to take care of you for the sake of, my own morals. So, she ends up taking him in, caring for him, things like that. Now, I don't want to get too much into the nuance of it because I do actually think this is worth the read. In my opinion, anything above like an 8 is something that I feel like you could go out of your way and, find this to read because it is like, relatively high quality. So if you like the idea, I think it's worth going out of your way. So I'm not going to go too spoilery on this one, but I'll be a little loose, I guess. Let's say. So the idea is basically, because she's this priestess, that has all these abilities, she, takes care of him. There's a little nuance with her priestly abilities and whatnot that they get into as the story progresses, but I'm not going to get into that. But the bigger idea is when he gets attacked by these bandits, she ends up knocking him out because his curse, starts to get set off, and that consumes all life. So he ends up losing his memory. When he loses his memory, she can't really just send him off, right? Like I said, she's pretty good-hearted, so even though, he almost killed her, he lost his memory, and she's going to take care of him until he gets it back. So a lot of the story is basically just her taking care of him. He's still, like, competent, I guess, to some degree, but he doesn't have his memory, so he's kind of, like, just fumbling about a little bit. And, she's taking care of him, things like that. That's most of the story, just kind of, like, her taking care of him. And then it kind of, like, as the story progresses, certain people kind of end up finding about his whereabouts, things like that. We get a little more nuance and, like, ideas about her, because she's being hunted. Her story individually kind of reminds me, like, there's a lot of these stories where, like, the main character helps random characters and, like, heals them or helps them, and then they end up, like, always supporting. That's kind of like her gist, because she has these, like, incredible holy abilities. She kind of just helps people along the way. She's relatively kind-hearted and everything, so she ends up kind of making all these allies and things like that. I do think it's a little, like, ridiculous, some of the allies. Like, they all, like, a lot of the people that she just randomly happens to, use her mystical holy abilities on just so happen to be, like, these people with, like, really high positions. A little silly, but again, I think you're allowed a little freedom with that in terms of these stories. But the gist with her, the gist is basically just she's taking care of him. People that know him are slowly coming after him. People that know her are kind of coming after her, and it's kind of just, this little, like, connection that these two have, being like a tie that links them together when everyone's coming after them. And of course, as the title implies, he mistook her for, his wife. He'd lost his memory. He takes all these different, like, context clues and kind of misconstrues them, and ends up thinking, like, oh, we have a relationship. Which I think is, like, the fun part of the series, like, this, Mistook, like, there's a little bit of a mistake on his part where he genuinely doesn't remember anything, but because she's so likable and helps him and kind and everything, he ends up kind of liking her. And just by the way of misreading all the context clues, he ends up thinking, like, oh, we were together at some point. We must have been together. Like, I came here for her or whatever. That's kind of like the main joke of the series, the main, like, fun point, right? The rest of it, I think, is just well written, storytelling, but it's relatively basic. But that's kind of like the fun idea, like the mistaking, for, wife part. So basically, like, the gimmick is, like, his memory loss kind of causing him to reach this conclusion, and then we kind of get to see, like, the jokes between the two, like her repeatedly telling him, I have nothing to do with you, and him, like, insisting that she's lying because she lied about other things, and it's just, it's like a funny little back and forth between the two. But that's, like, just a basic rundown of the series. I'm just gonna give, like, the essay. I'm gonna go into the SAE just for the sake of it. I think you should just read it. It's a solid series. I recommend it, but I'll do this just for the sake of, doing it in every other video. So what's the gist? So we have, like, story, art, enjoyment here. What would I say in terms of story? A lot of the basic isekai elements that are in this are pretty well written. I will say there's a little bit of that element of, like, protagonist luck that comes into play, but there's also the element of, like, I think it's fun having this mistaken identity thing. So I think in terms of storytelling, I think I think for the sake of me just finding it a little interesting and it's a little bit different, I'll give it an 8. I haven't really seen too much of this, especially, like, not the way they play it with this and how, like, slow it, like, going it is, and it really sets things up, so I think it deserves that. Art-wise, 7. It's quality art, but it doesn't do anything super fantastic. It's not very unique. Yeah, they have like the thorn aesthetic for like curses and things like that because like that's this whole thing with the monster. But and that's like stuff I've seen before. Not really anything special. Enjoyment wise, 8. I think it's refreshing. It's something at least a little bit new. Considering how many things I read, I feel like it's fun to get anything. So yeah, overall 8. I think it's worth reading. I think I would go out of my way to read it. It's pretty good. Looking back, like the story is definitely like the fun part. It's a little unique in terms of that. The art, it's not going to blow your mind or anything. It's good quality art, but it's not necessarily special. It's not unique. The designs aren't really that unique, but it's good. You're not going to complain about the art. Enjoyment-wise, I mean, if you're like me and you've read like a million stories, this is, I think, a satisfying little story that kind of, I'm not saying it's entirely unique, but it's not common. So I think it's fun. So yeah, I think an 8's fair. I think overall that equates to about an 8. You could say between a 7 and an 8, whatever, but I think it's a solid story that I would recommend reading. It's not something, like when I think of like 7s and below, it's more so like, oh, this is just where I would rate it. If you see it, that's what you'll know. But this is one of those stories where I'm like, yeah, I think you can go out of your way to read this. Like, it's pretty good. But yeah, I think that's about it. If you have any other stories you want me to read, leave it down below. Even if I've read it, I'll read it again. I don't really care. And yeah. I don't know, like, comment, subscribe, blah, 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 and I'll see you.